The cold, metallic hum of the Fortitude reverberated through Captain Sarah Jensen's bones as she walked briskly down the sterile, brightly lit corridors. The station was small compared to the fleets humanity had once commanded, but it was the last defense between the human colonies and the relentless Zorn Empire. Sarah's boots clicked sharply against the steel floor, each step echoing her duty, her unyielding commitment to her crew, and the weight of leadership she carried every day. In the dim lighting of the command center, Sarah's sharp eyes scanned the monitors, her mind already racing through the latest reports. She was a woman of few words, not one to waste time with unnecessary chatter. Every decision, every command was deliberate, calculated. At 34, she had already earned the respect of her crew and fellow officers. She was tough, competent, and trusted. But beneath that unwavering exterior was a soul worn thin by the relentless pressure of a war that seemed to have no end. The Zorn had been a threat for over a decade, and their cruelty had no bounds. They were an ancient species, older than humanity by millennia, and had long maintained a policy of eradicating species they considered a threat to galactic peace. Humanity was their most recent target. Since the first skirmishes, the war had escalated with each passing year, and now Sarah found herself commanding the last line of defense in a war humanity was losing. The Fortitude wasn't much to look at. It was a military outpost, a fortress in space. Its sleek design and sturdy weaponry were all that stood between the remaining human colonies and complete destruction. The station was strategically located on the edge of the galaxy, where the Zoran had yet to fully breach. It was supposed to be a safe zone, a place where humanity could regroup and mount a counterattack. But the truth was, Sarah didn't know how much longer it could hold. As she entered the command center, the soft buzzing of machinery and the steady hum of the ship's operations filled the air. Her crew, a mix of seasoned veterans and young recruits, worked tirelessly at their stations, their faces illuminated by the flickering glow of the consoles. They were all experts in their fields, and Sarah knew she could trust them. Still, there was a palpable tension in the air, the kind that came before a storm. Everyone knew the Zoran were coming. It was only a matter of time. "Captain, you're needed in operations," Lieutenant Marco Reyes called out from across the room, his voice steady but carrying a hint of urgency. Marco was one of the few people who could match Sarah's intensity. He was loyal, but over the years, Sarah had seen his resolve begin to falter. The weight of the endless battle was wearing him down. She nodded curtly, her expression hardening as she approached the central holomap of the galaxy. Marco, tall with short-cropped dark hair and a face weathered by the war, stood by the console, his eyes glued to the screen. He didn't need to explain. Sarah had been briefed on the situation earlier. The Zoran had increased their movements at the border, and the intelligence reports were ominous. "Captain, we've just received a distress signal from Kuros 4, Marco said, his voice tight with apprehension. "The colony's defenses have been breached. The Zoran are already inside." The message was brief. It didn't sound good. Sarah's pulse quickened, but she kept her face unreadable. Kuros 4 was one of the outer colonies, one of the few left on the fringes of human space. It wasn't a major hub, but it was still vital to the human effort. Losing Kuros 4 would be a blow to morale. Losing it now, with the Zorn on the offensive, could be the tipping point. She stepped closer to the holomap, eyes narrowing as she studied the data streaming across the display. The Zorn were methodical. They didn't waste time on needless fights. This wasn't a skirmish. It was an assault, a full-scale attack. "Is there a way to make it in time?" Sarah asked, her voice low but firm. She was already calculating their options in her mind, weighing the risks. Marco's fingers flew over the console as he worked the navigation controls. "We can make it there in just under 3 hours at maximum speed, but we'll be cutting it close. We won't have reinforcements. The fleet's too far out, and we're spread thin. We're on our own." Sarah's jaw tightened. "Prepare the crew for deployment. We'll be on the first transport out." Marco hesitated, his eyes meeting hers. "Captain, are we sure this is the best course of action? We're talking about an entire colony. We don't even know if there are any survivors left." Sarah met his gaze, unwavering. "If we don't act, There won't be a next time. We fight or we die. The weight of the decision settled between them. Marco nodded, though there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Sarah knew the toll this war was taking on him, on all of them, but there was no room for doubt now. She had a duty to uphold, and that duty was to the human race. As the crew scrambled to prepare for departure, Sarah stood by the window, staring out into the vast expanse of space. The stars seemed to mock her, distant and cold. Humanity had reached for the stars, only to find the darkness of war waiting for them. Her mind raced. The Zoran had underestimated humans before, but this time felt different. The Zoran were not just attacking for territory. They were attacking for extinction, and if they succeeded, humanity would be wiped from the galaxy. But Sarah refused to believe that. She refused to let her people fall. If this was to be the last stand, then she would make it count. The door behind her slid open, and Marco stepped in, his face grim. All preparations are complete. We leave in 15 minutes. Sarah turned from the window and nodded. Good. Let's make sure they know we're coming. The Fortitude rumbled to life as it disengaged from the station's docking port, the engines thrumming with power as the crew prepared for battle. Sarah stood at the helm, her hands clasped tightly behind her back. She felt the weight of every pair of eyes on her, the expectations, the hope that they would make it through this. The ship accelerated, slicing through the void as they made their way toward Kuros 4, leaving the safety of the station behind. The tension was thick in the air, but Sarah couldn't afford to let fear take root. Not now. Kuros 4 had to survive. Humanity had to survive. The inciting incident, the distress call, has set the stage for the conflict. It's clear now that Sarah's leadership, her resolve, and her willingness to risk everything will define the next phase of this war. The stakes are high, and the crew's loyalty to her will be tested in the days ahead. With each passing moment, the realization grows. If the Zoran have their way, humanity will not only lose a colony, it will lose everything. Chapter 2, Into the Fire. The Fortitude descended toward the shattered remains of Kuros 4. From the command center, Captain Sarah Jensen watched the holographic display showing the colony's battered surface. A dark cloud of smoke billowed from the once thriving city below, and the faint outline of Zoran warships lingered in the atmosphere like vultures circling their prey. Target coordinates locked in. Captain, Lieutenant Marco Reyes's voice broke through the silence, his voice unsteady for the first time in months. Approaching landing zone now. Sarah gripped the armrest of her chair, her knuckles turning white. How much longer until we can begin the rescue operation? Marco hesitated before responding. It'll be tight. The Zoran are already on the ground. We'll need to move fast. Then we move fast, Sarah said, her tone unyielding. Her hands moved over the controls with practiced precision. Every part of her body felt alert, every nerve lit with tension. This wasn't just another battle. It was the turning point. They couldn't afford to fail, not when humanity's very survival was on the line. The Fortitude shook slightly as it broke through the upper atmosphere, the deep rumble of the ship's engines vibrating through the hull. Sarah watched the surface of Kuros 4 grow larger on the screen, and she could see the extent of the devastation. Burned-out buildings, craters, and smoldering wreckage. The colony was a ghost of its former self, and it was about to be swallowed by the Zoran. Deploying landing gear, Marco announced, snapping Sarah out of her thoughts. In 5-4, the ship groaned as the landing thrusters activated, slowing their descent. Brace yourselves, Sarah barked to the crew, her voice sharp. We're landing in hostile territory. The ship shuddered as it hit the ground, the metallic screech of its landing struts echoing throughout the cabin. Sarah immediately unstrapped herself from the seat, her boots hitting the floor with a determined thud. Get ready to move out. We leave in 5 minutes. The crew jumped into action, grabbing weapons and securing the landing gear. Sarah's eyes swept across the room, taking in the faces of her crew. Tired, worn-out faces, each of them a reflection of the relentless war they had been fighting for so long. Marco stepped up beside her, his expression unreadable. I don't have to tell you how bad it looks out there. We're running on fumes, and this is a last-ditch effort to get survivors. If the Zoran aren't already slaughtering them, they're enslaving them." Sarah nodded grimly. The stakes were higher than ever. There was no room for hesitation. If they didn't act quickly, they could lose everything. "We can't let that happen," Sarah said, her voice hard with resolve. "No one gets left behind. Not on my watch." The crew filed out of the Fortitude in squads, moving swiftly and with purpose. Sarah led the charge, her boots thudding against the cracked and burning earth. The air was thick with smoke, and the acrid stench of burning fuel stung her nostrils. As they advanced through the rubble, the sounds of distant gunfire and explosions echoed across the war-torn landscape. They reached the remains of the colony's command center, where a few survivors had been holed up. The small group of men and women were huddled together, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. Sarah's heart clenched. These people had seen the worst of the Zoran. They lost everything. "Captain, it's good to see you." One of the survivors, a woman named Kira, said, her voice shaky but grateful. She clutched a rifle close to her chest, as if the weapon could protect her from the horrors outside. "We've got you," Sarah said, kneeling down to meet Kira's gaze. "Where's the rest of your team?" Kira shook her head. "Most of them are gone, wiped out by the first wave. We've been hiding for hours, hoping someone would come." Sarah stood and motioned for her team to secure the area. "We're getting you out of here, all of you." But as Sarah turned to leave, a deafening explosion rocked the ground, throwing them all to the ground. The force of the blast sent a wave of heat and dust over them, and Sarah's ears rang. She stumbled to her feet, disoriented, but only for a second. The fire from the explosion was already licking the air, and the sounds of Zoran forces moving and grew louder. They had found them. "Move! Move!" Sarah shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Get to the ship." The crew scrambled to their feet, weapons drawn, forming a protective perimeter around the survivors. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she scanned the horizon, looking for any signs of the incoming Zoran forces. They were too close. The odds were stacking against them, and they were running out of time. "I count at least 3 squads of Zoran troops advancing on our position," Marco reported urgently. "We won't make it to the Fortitude without a fight." Sarah's mind raced. There was no way they could outrun the Zoran, but they couldn't afford to stand their ground either. They had to find a way to even the odds. "There's an old weapons cache about 2 clicks north of here," Sarah said. "We'll make a stand there. The Zoran won't expect us to fight back this far from the ship." "Are you sure?" Marco asked, his voice full of concern. "It's a gamble, Sarah. It's all we have left," she snapped, her tone resolute. "If we don't fight, we're dead anyway. Move out now." The crew pushed forward, moving with military precision despite the overwhelming danger. They trekked across the desolate landscape, each step taking them deeper into enemy territory. Sarah's heart raced, the weight of the responsibility heavy on her shoulders. She was leading them into what could very well be their final stand, but she knew this was the only way to ensure the survivors made it out alive. As they reached the weapons cache, Sarah's heart sank. The Zoran were already there, their sleek, armored forms crouched low, weapons raised, preparing for the kill. The unmistakable hum of their energy weapons filled the air, a sound that had become all too familiar over the years. "Set up a defensive perimeter," Sarah barked, drawing her own weapon. "Get ready for a fight." The battle was brutal. The Zoran forces were relentless, their weapons precise, their strategy flawless. But Sarah's team was determined. Every man and woman fought with the fury of those who had nothing left to lose. Marco, ever the calm strategist, directed the fire while Sarah led from the front, gunning down Zoran soldiers as they advanced. The sound of laser fire filled the air, and the smell of burning flesh clung to the smoke-filled atmosphere. For every Zoran they took down, 2 more seemed to take their place. The odds were quickly tipping in the enemy's favor. As Sarah fired another shot, her vision blurred for a second. Her body ached, and fatigue threatened to take over. But there was no time to rest. Not yet. Then, through the haze of battle, she saw him. The Zoran general, Zroth. His dark, imposing figure stood at the back of his forces, watching the carnage unfold with cold, calculating eyes. The enemy leader had been overseeing this attack from the start, and now he was here to finish it. Sarah's blood ran cold. Droth. The name was whispered in fear across the galaxy. He was the mastermind behind the Zoran war effort, the one who had orchestrated humanity's destruction. And now, he was in front of her. The realization hit Sarah with the force of a sledgehammer. They weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for the future of humanity. And she wasn't going to let it slip away. To me, Sarah shouted, rallying her team. The fight was far from over. You said, Chapter 3. The battle was chaos incarnate. The dust of Kuros IV's surface billowed through the air as the sounds of laser fire and explosions filled the grim atmosphere. Sarah's hands shook, not from fear but from the weight of what she knew had to be done. They were losing ground, and she could feel the battle slipping away with every passing second. The Zoran forces were relentless, their soldiers tactical and cold, their superior technology overwhelming. And then there was Droth, the commander of this ruthless campaign, watching it all unfold with chilling detachment. "Hold the line," Sarah shouted, her voice cutting through the madness. "We can't let them break through." Her team fought with everything they had, but the casualties were mounting. Every time Sarah turned to check on one of her soldiers, she found another fallen. The Zoran had pushed them to their limits, and now, every inch they gained felt like it came at the cost of something more important, someone they would never see again. Marco was by her side, his face grim as he fired off shot after shot, but even his seasoned calm couldn't hide the stress that had begun to show in his movements. He was getting slower. They all were. "We can't keep this up, Sarah," Marco said through clenched teeth. He ducked behind a large rock, reloading his weapon. "We're outnumbered, outgunned. We need to fall back." Sarah looked around, her heart heavy. The once pristine colony now lay in ruins, and the enemy had advanced farther than she thought possible. She couldn't give up now, not when so many had already fallen. "Not yet," Sarah said, her voice strained but filled with determination. "We hold here just a little longer." But even as she said the words, she knew they were a lie. They were out of time, and everyone knew it. Her crew had been pushed to the brink. Only a handful of them were still fighting. The Zoran were closing in, and Sarah's options were running out. Then, the sound of a blast echoed from behind them, sending a shockwave that knocked her to the ground. Sarah scrambled to her feet, disoriented for a moment, but when her vision cleared, she saw it. Marco, sprawled out on the ground, blood pooling around him. "Marco!" Sarah screamed, rushing to his side. Marco's hand was limp, but his eyes were still open, his breath ragged. He reached up weakly and touched Sarah's arm. "Sarah," he gasped, his voice barely audible. "You're not going to win. Don't let them take everything." Tears blurred Sarah's vision, but she wiped them away furiously. She couldn't let herself break. Not now. Marco had been with her from the beginning, but now it was too late. "I'm not leaving you," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "We'll get you to the med bay." "Listen to me," Marco interrupted, his grip tightening slightly. "You have to win. You have to. If not for us, then for everyone else." Sarah's stomach churned as she looked at his pale, bloodied face. His words didn't make sense. She couldn't afford to lose any more of them. But Marco's eyes were pleading with her. This wasn't about them anymore. It was about them, the rest of humanity. The sound of more Zoran soldiers approaching shook Sarah from her grief. She met Marco's gaze for one last time, and with all the strength she could muster, nodded. "I will," she promised, though she wasn't sure how. Sarah stood, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had to do. She wasn't a stranger to loss, but this was different. Marco had been the one person who'd always been there, the one person who had trusted her unconditionally. And now he was gone. The thought stung, but there was no time to mourn. The Zoran were coming. The betrayal. The moment she turned, a sharp cry broke through the air. One of her men was down. The world seemed to slow. Sarah's blood ran cold when she saw it wasn't just any soldier. It was Lieutenant Reyes. A blast had hit him square in the chest, and he collapsed, his body unmoving. A guttural growl of frustration built in Sarah's chest as she rushed to him. But before she could reach him, something more horrifying happened. One of the Zoran soldiers emerged from behind a nearby crater, dragging a man along with him. Sarah's heart stopped. It was Reyes. The soldier, eyes wide with desperation, pushed his fellow officer forward, and the Zoran soldier raised a weapon to Reyes' head. He was alive, but barely. "Stop!" Sarah shouted, her weapon ready. She didn't care if she had to kill them all. She couldn't let them take Reyes. But the Zoran soldier didn't even flinch. Instead, it spoke. "Reyes," it said in cold, perfect English. "Your people have failed. Surrender, and we may spare you." The words cut through Sarah like a blade, but what came next was even worse. Reyes, her second in command, the man who had once sworn loyalty to her, looked up with something new in his eyes, something that shattered her. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said, his voice low. "I had no choice. They promised me, if I helped them, humanity would be spared." The truth hit Sarah like a freight train, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. The very man she had trusted, the one who had fought alongside her, had betrayed them all. He had willingly handed himself over to the enemy in exchange for his own survival. And now, he was condemning them all to certain death. "No!" Sarah screamed, her voice raw with betrayal. But there was no time for a confrontation. Reyes was already being dragged toward the Zoran ship. The choice had been made. There was nothing she could do to save him. The weight of the betrayal crushed Sarah, but there was no room for weakness. Not now. She steeled herself. The fight had just gotten personal. The revelation. Amid the chaos, an idea began to form in Sarah's mind, one that she didn't want to consider. The Zoran were not just after territory. They weren't merely conquering. They were hunting. They were eradicating humanity. Yes, but there was something more to their tactics. Something hidden beneath their cold, calculating exterior. Sarah's thoughts swirled as the pieces came together. It wasn't just about killing humanity. They were taking something. Taking it for themselves. But what? The answer hit her like a physical blow. The Zoran had always been obsessed with eliminating threats, but now she realized the terrifying truth. They weren't just seeking power. They were erasing the human spirit, the one thing they feared most. And they wouldn't stop until every last trace of humanity was wiped away. Preparing for the final confrontation, Sarah knew that she had only one option left. She needed to stop them before they could reach the final stages of their plan. And to do that, she would need to strike at the heart of their operation, the Zoran flagship. But getting there would require everything she had left. She had no men to send, no reinforcements coming, and no backup. This was her fight now. She turned to her remaining crew, now reduced to a handful of survivors. The fire in her chest ignited once more. "We're going after their flagship," Sarah said, her voice sharp with purpose. "Prepare yourselves. This is our last chance to win." They would either die trying, or they would make the Zoran pay for what they had done. And for the first time since the war began, Sarah truly believed they had a fighting chance. The stakes have reached a fever pitch as Sarah faces her deepest betrayals, the death of her second-in-command, and the revelation that the war was far more than just about conquest. It was about wiping out humanity's very spirit. As the fight escalates, Sarah prepares for the final confrontation, knowing that this battle will either end with victory or the extinction of everything she fought for. Chapter 4: The Fortitude surged through the black void, its engines straining as Sarah led her crew toward the heart of the Zoran fleet. The stakes had never been higher. The war for humanity's survival had reached its ultimate moment. This was the final assault. If they could take out the Zoran flagship, they might have a chance to win the war. But the risk was undeniable. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running on fumes. Sarah stood at the helm, her mind sharp and focused despite the exhaustion that weighed down every part of her. There was no room for failure. Not now. "Status report," Sarah barked, turning to Marco. His face was pale but resolute. His eyes narrowed as he looked at the screens in front of him. "We're on course," Marco said, voice steady but heavy with the weight of what was to come. "The Zoran flagship is just ahead, but we're not the only ones heading in. We've got a whole fleet coming our way." Sarah's grip on the command chair tightened, her knuckles turning white. It felt as if the entire galaxy was closing in around them. The odds were impossible, but Sarah knew there was no other option. This had to be done, once and for all. Humanity's very existence hung in the balance. "We don't back down," she said, her voice unwavering. "We push forward." As they neared the flagship, the intensity of the Zoran fleet's firepower became evident. The enormous warships flanked the flagship, forming a deadly blockade. The Fortitude was just one ship in a sea of alien vessels, but Sarah had learned to trust her crew and herself. It was time to make the impossible possible. "Prepare for combat," Sarah ordered, her voice a command that pierced the tension in the room. "We'll go in with everything we've got. I need a clear path to the flagship. We can't waste time." The Fortitude shuddered as its weapons systems powered up. Laser cannons and energy weapons hummed in anticipation. The crew moved with practiced precision, executing the battle plan Sarah had drilled into them. Despite the fear, they were focused, knowing that this was their final chance. The battle. The Fortitude plunged into the heart of the Zoran fleet, its weapons blazing. The air was thick with the sounds of explosions and the flashes of energy blasts. The Zoran were relentless, their ships attacking with precision, their technology far superior to anything humanity had developed. But Sarah's crew fought back with everything they had. Every shot fired was an act of defiance, an affirmation that humanity wasn't going to die quietly. Sarah could feel the heat of the battle, the pounding of the Fortitude's hull as it was struck by enemy fire. She heard the whir of damaged systems, the alarms blaring through the ship's interior. But there was no time to pause. Every second counted. "Status on weapons?" Sarah demanded, her voice cutting through the chaos. 50% power remaining, Marco replied, his hands moving quickly over the console. "We've got enough for one last push, but it's going to be close." "Make it count," Sarah said, her voice low but commanding. She had one objective now: get to the flagship. No matter what. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she couldn't afford to falter. They were humanity's last hope. There was no turning back. The final confrontation. The flagship loomed before them, an immense structure of dark metal and shifting energy shields. It was surrounded by dozens of smaller ships, but Sarah knew they didn't have the luxury of time to engage every single one. They needed to breach the flagship's defenses now. Targeting the flagship's core, Marco said, his voice sharp with focus. He pulled a lever, and the Fortitude's weapons fired in unison. A brilliant explosion lit the darkness of space as energy blasts hit the flagship's shields, weakening them, but not enough to break through. "When not getting through," Marco said, his voice tinged with frustration. "They're too strong." But Sarah's eyes burned with determination. She had to do this. She had to reach the heart of the flagship. "Send everything we've got to that core," Sarah commanded. "We'll take down their shields one way or another." Her mind raced, calculating every angle. The Zoran's shields were strong, but they had one vulnerability: their core. The heart of the flagship, where the Zoran controlled their ship's systems. If she could reach it, they could cripple the entire fleet. Sarah stood tall, her voice calm but resolute. "Brace for impact," she said. With a final, deafening blast, the Fortitude's weapons tore through the flagship's defenses. The shields flickered and collapsed, leaving the heart of the ship exposed. The moment Sarah had been waiting for had come. "Now," she shouted. The crew fired everything they had, launching one final assault on the core. The ship shuddered under the intensity of the attack, but Sarah knew it was working. The flagship's defenses collapsed, and the core exploded in a burst of energy, sending shockwaves through the fleet. Resolution. The flagship's destruction sent ripples through the Zoran fleet. The remaining warships, disoriented by the loss of their command center, scattered. The tide of battle had shifted. "We did it," Marco said, his voice a mixture of disbelief and relief. He wiped the sweat from his brow and glanced at Sarah. "We actually did it." But Sarah didn't feel the triumph. The victory felt hollow. They had won the battle, but at what cost? Marco was gone, and so many others. The crew was reduced to a fraction of what it had been. They had fought bravely, but the scars of the war were evident in every face. Sarah stood at the helm, her gaze fixed on the debris floating in space, the remnants of the Zoran fleet. She had led them to victory, but she knew that this was only the first step. The war was far from over. Humanity had survived, but at a heavy price. "We've won," Sarah said quietly, her voice breaking the silence in the command center. But at what cost? Her crew looked to her, their expressions a mixture of exhaustion and relief. They had fought and bled for this moment, and now it was finally here. But as Sarah looked out into the vastness of space, she knew the battle for humanity's future was far from over. Final emotional beat. As Sarah turned from the command center's viewports, she felt a flicker of hope, buried deep beneath the weight of their losses. The war had not broken her. It had only hardened her resolve. Humanity had faced annihilation, and yet they had risen. They had fought back, and in that, there was something beautiful, something worth saving. She thought of Marco, of the soldiers they had lost, and of the survivors who remained. They had all given everything for this moment, and now they would rebuild. Sarah felt the burn of tears in her eyes, but she wiped them away quickly. This was not a time for weakness. With a steady breath, Sarah turned to her crew. "We move forward," she said, her voice steady and sure. "The fight isn't over, but we've shown them what humanity can do." And with that, she led her crew forward into the unknown, a small glimmer of hope rising in her heart. Humanity was still here, and they would fight on. In this final chapter, Sarah and her crew faced the ultimate test of their willpower, fighting to destroy the Zoran flagship and turning the tide of war. The victory is hard-won, with significant losses along the way, but in the end, it is a testament to humanity's resilience. The emotional beat of the chapter ties back to the themes of sacrifice, survival, and the unbreakable spirit of humanity.